Hello, my name is Zach Baldwin, and I am the director of InterVarsity Student Affairs Christian Network. I'm also the host of Intersection Interviews, a show that explores the overlap of faith, work, and higher education with a variety of voices from around higher ed. This is a special episode of Intersection Interviews as it is being co-sponsored by InterVarsity's Emerging Scholars Network. Appropriately, I'm joined by Boyun Sul, a graduate student studying higher education who also serves as an academic advisor and campus minister at the University of North Texas. We talk about the challenges of starting grad school during COVID, the Great Disillusionment within higher ed, and much more. And now, on with the show.
Well, welcome everyone to our third episode of Intersection Interviews. I'm joined today by Boyun Sul, and I'm so excited to have you here on the program, Boyun. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is awesome.
So, Boyun, you are a graduate student in the time of COVID. You're also an academic advisor. So you are both a student and working with students. So aside from that, though, I want our audience to get to know you a little bit better. So is there maybe like a item or object on your desk that shows us a little bit more of who you are and what you like to do for fun?
Yeah, when you asked me to prepare for this, I was thinking, should I go for something more professional? But, I just want to show my real self. So this is a little frog crocheted, like stuffed animal that my friend made for me. Her name is Lizzie. She's like a second mom to me. And so, yeah, I have a really big frog obsession. So that's one of the fun facts about me and something that my friends know. So they give me a lot of frog related stuff like stickers and making crochet stuffed animals for me. So
I love it. So you love frogs and you clearly love students.
yeah. Oh yes, that too.
I love it. That's awesome. Well, so now that we know a little bit more about your loves, I'd love to hear about people's first time that they realized that they were really wanted to pursue higher education. So I know for me, it was a complete accident. I got into the higher education side of campus my freshman year. I got assigned as a work study to a community engagement office and didn't know that that wouldn't just set a trajectory for my free time for those 4 years and what I did over the summer and all that, but also would dictate what I did after college. So how did you get involved in higher ed? What was that first moment where you were like, I love thinking about students and the structure of the college and all that?
Yeah. I kind of call it a similar accident as well because in college, I went to the University of Texas at Dallas. I actually wasn't part of housing. I actually didn't even go to an orientation, but I got really interested in higher education because of my intern year with InterVarsity. And so this was actually during the time of COVID, everything was virtual. But because of COVID, I actually got to see the impact of the pandemic and how the university was handling things, and it revealed a lot of injustices and problems within the university. And so I would see my students dropping out of college, retention rates going down, mental health issues, and I'd see a lot of the problems they had within higher education. And so because of that, I decided to pursue a master's degree in higher education because I realized that my job as a minister, I couldn't actually change structures. I couldn't be within the university making these big decisions about accommodating for students or what to do during COVID. So that's why I wanted to go into this program and make change internally. And I felt like I was called to that. So that's why I decided to go into higher ed.
That's fascinating. And too, I love the tethering of like you're working with individual students, right? And so you're caring for these students, and then you're seeing the trail back to campus structures and policies and how that's shaping in their individual lives, right? But then thinking like if I want to really see students thrive and flourish, like it's these big things that I have to tackle too. That's and all that happened sort of unraveled for you during COVID. Am I getting that right? That during COVID is when you're seeing these unique sorts of problems present themselves, not necessarily that you hadn't seen structural issues in the university before, but that you had seen some of these things during COVID.
Yeah, yeah. During COVID, I think everyone had a existential crisis in some way, whether it was through questioning their job or their life. And I definitely went through a similar process because I was actually on a healthcare track. And so I was going to become like a PA for anesthesiology and apply for that. But I became really passionate after seeing my students during COVID, and I've always had a heart for college students. But yeah, it was definitely because of what you were saying, like because of those structures and relations to students that yeah, I wanted to pursue that degree. So I don't know if that answered your question or not.
No,
But
no, I did. That's remarkable. So I, I'm a little curious about your decision-making process because it feels like in COVID, like you were like you had just mentioned, like it seems like so many folks within higher education, really within any field, right, are questioning where they're at. That's a really big shift, and you're not just thinking of shifting from one field to another, and you certainly weren't thinking of shifting from a less lucrative field to a more lucrative field. You were thinking of shifting into an incredibly challenging field. So what was that decision making process? What was that like for you? Was that something where it was like overnight you're like, I realized this? Or did you take time to like talk with other folks in higher ed about their experiences, or just how did you come to that decision like in the midst of COVID? Because that to me is like, that's amazing that that's when your sort of calling into higher ed solidified.
yeah, no, it's very complicated. I'll say first of all, I think my ascent into healthcare because I majored in neuroscience. I had no idea that I was going to go into this field. I always knew that my heart wasn't fully into healthcare, but then after doing my intern year with InterVarsity and just during that year, I just found myself caring so much for college students, but I realized at some point that the way I wanted to work with college students was not necessarily only within ministry, and
Mhm.
that I started caring a lot about retention rates. Like seeing my students drop out of college was really
Mhm.
heartbreaking for me. And
Yeah.
so I realized I can't control that as a staff, but if I get this degree, then I can begin to control that. I just saw how so many of these structures were affecting my students during COVID. And so InterVarsity, I think, is actually the biggest reason why I went to higher education. Additionally, with doing more DEI work, like diversity inclusion work within the university, I can't really do that as a staff, but I can do that as a higher education administrator. So those are the biggest reasons I went into higher ed is one, like I just realized that my heart wasn't super into healthcare. And then two, it was really because of noticing some of the students and the impacts that structures had on them during COVID.
Mm, that's incredible, Boyan. Tell me a little bit more. So you are, so you're studying right now, but you're also a graduate academic advisor too, working with undergraduate students in the honors college. Is that right?
Yeah, in the honors college. Yes.
So, what are some things that you've learned from working with students that have surprised you? So maybe things that weren't covered in class, or things that maybe just took on a new meaning as as you've been working with students in your academic advising capacity.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good question. I'd actually say, surprisingly, the first thing was how sensitive I had to be to the Holy Spirit and
Mm,
even the emotional sensitivity and cultural sensitivity. You wouldn't think that as a student affairs professional that your job would include so many aspects of caring for students, like spiritually, mentally, physically, emotionally. And although my advising sessions are only technically supposed to be for 30 minutes, I get to know a lot about these students through looking at their educational records, looking at their financial aid, and really getting context for what their lives are like. And as I'm helping them plan out their degree, we're planning out, when are you planning to graduate? Can you graduate at this time? Or maybe they're trying to speed up their college experience as much as possible because they have to take care of their family. And so something that's really surprised me is how much sensitivity you need to have to be in this job when you work with students directly. And so a big part has been me listening to the Holy Spirit as well while I'm advising these students,
Mm,
and just really trying to kind of care for these students. And even should I ask this question of how are you really, sensing whether or not they might need some extra counseling that's not just advising, but maybe they need to talk to someone within administration, especially because I am a queer person of color. And so when I see these students from minoritized backgrounds, I think it's very important to me that they feel cared for. Especially, I think the university sometimes does not care for these students as much as they can or should. So I find myself uh, really being surprised by the amount of sensitivity, and even by the amount of Holy Spirit sensitivity that I need to have to take care of students while on my job.
yeah, that's so good. I love that too, that like prayerful and open posture, because it does seem like too, like even you're going from this journey of you were working with students in a ministerial capacity to you want to work with students in a work with students in structures, right? So that you can affect those structures that are keeping students from flourishing. And then even in this role, like there's limitations, or there's even more layers of brokenness that you're coming across. And so um, I love I love that posture, because I think what it reminds us is that even in moments where there's these huge structural things that we're trying to figure out, and broken, just brokenness throughout the university, that um, there is power, there's real power that we have to tap into, which is we can pray and fast over the things in the university. So, and we can pray and fast on the move, right? So it's not just, oh man, this thing's so terrible, and oof, like I really hope the Lord fixes that, but rather that we can work towards making those things better while also being in that posture of, yeah, asking for the Lord to move. That's so good. I think too, as you're talking, like it's so clear how much you love students, and how much um, you want to be able to care for them in ways that don't just meet immediate needs, but also meet the larger needs that frame the way students are able to have not just a good education, but be set up for after they go through college. Um, and what I think of is that right now you are a student, you are working with students, right? Like this is your whole life. And COVID's been weird. So I think when we talked before, I think you're actually in the classroom, but COVID's been weird in that for a lot of our time, our workplace and our quiet place and everything else is like all rolled into one. So boundaries in the time of COVID just feel like they have gone out the window. So as you are both for your own education, but then also working with students in your higher education administration work, everything you're doing is revolving around campus. So how is it that you're setting good boundaries, or how are you trying to pursue setting good boundaries in the midst of that? Because COVID has just sort of disrupted our sense of what good rhythms and what good boundaries looks like.
Yeah, I'll definitely start with work. It's very hard because COVID has created a lot of needs and a lot of, I guess, yeah, there's just an endless list of what our students are needing from student affairs professionals. And for me, I've just realized I cannot insert myself into every DEI conversation. I cannot say yes to all of these new initiatives that universities are trying to start up. But instead, I have a very rigid job description. So I try to be very I guess, rigid with what my duties are. And I say, this is what I was hired to do. And anything outside of this, like, I'll either say no to or ask for compensation for,
Mhm.
and or ask to do less in my actual required job description. So those are some big things for me, is that I've had to learn to say no a lot. And that has been really hard because I'm someone who wants to pour my heart out for these students and these initiatives, but I cannot say yes to everything. And it's also a disservice to the students I'm currently advising if I'm just stretched out all over the place. But instead, I've learned with DEI, like diversity inclusion, that can be done in anything you're doing. So it doesn't have to be like you have to do an initiative outside of your job description, but you can really do diversity inclusion work in your advising sessions and be a source of representation. I don't constantly need to be a part of these conversations that aren't necessarily in my job description or that I have time for sometimes. And with school, I think that it's really hard as someone who is a queer American. I feel like I have to prove myself that I am in this program and I deserve to be here. And a lot of that leads to perfectionism. I have to make every assignment as great as I can. However, I just, not every assignment can be great. And so something I've learned is that, one, there are assignments, there are research projects that need to be great. Like, these are the things I really want to pour my heart into. But
Mhm.
then there are some assignments that you just need to get done. And I think that has been something I've been working on since last semester. I think a part of it too is because of COVID and because of this sudden change into higher education, I do feel like I have less experience than my peers. I feel like I need to be constantly working up. COVID has really affected, like, yeah, my life and like kind of the expectations I also have for myself. But I've definitely been working on myself mentally. I've been setting these rigid boundaries with work and, yeah, having a better hold of my schedule and my capacities and knowing my boundaries and limits.
That's so good. I think so the two big pieces I'm hearing is, one, you're communicating your boundaries to other people. And that just seems scary, right? So I think first off, hats off to you, because that's amazing. And I think oftentimes we build it up in our heads of like, if I communicate this, like I'm gonna get fired like right away. Right. And not that there might not be tensions and all with that, but clearly you're still in your job, right? And so you've been setting these boundaries, and like communicating that is great. And I think that's really helpful. And then the other piece is, in a culture that tells us that our value is dependent on oftentimes a letter grade, right, especially within higher education, saying like, I'm going to put good effort into this, but I'm not going to kill myself to do that. Like, that's a good word. I think that's still something we might need to chew on longer, because that's like, but if I don't score the absolute highest, like who am I? Right? Like that's still in the back of our mind. So I think that's really good and that's really helpful. Um, I think as we draw to a close, I think there's this reality right now that as you are aware of and you've already alluded to in our conversation, of just um, COVID has exacerbated existing um, problems within higher education. And one thing that was written about within the past year by Lindsay Ellis in the Chronicle of Higher Education was this idea of the Great Disillusionment within higher education, which is that so many more professionals, it's already a field that has a high turnover rate, but it just seems like so many more professionals are questioning, is it worth sticking it out in higher education? Um, so I guess I really have two questions there, which is, how is knowing that reality and being aware of that, how has that impacted you as you've begun to think about pursuing this career in higher education? Because you made this drastic change from healthcare over to higher ed, still a field that's helping people. I will note that. So you went from one field to helping people to another. But how did that impact? How is that impacting your thinking about this career? Um, and then what gives you hope for the future, as you're stepping into a place where there is so much discussion of disillusionment within the field?
That's a good question. I honestly feel like I lose hope with every class I take as we study the historical roots of higher education and the amount of colonial roots and the roots we have to slavery in higher education. It's been really, yeah, I've been experiencing a lot of disillusionment in that. I can also see, because the kind of work I want to go into is mostly DEI type of work. And I can see why most of the positions are open at UNT. We basically only have two people in that department. And after being a graduate student here, I can see why. There's a lot of issues with DEI within the university. And I think something that has given me hope is seeing my classmates who are aspiring student affairs professionals too, but we all have very similar visions. And so part of these people leaving, it's made it hard. I think it's very hard to see so many openings and so many great people leaving this field. But then it also gives me hope because we have young people, young visionaries, and young professionals who are very on board for this new vision of the university that really have the power to change these structures.
Mm.
And that gives me a lot of hope, is that I love my classmates and I know that they're going to go into these positions and they're going to be able to change the university. Um, Not overnight, of course. It might be a very long time until we reach like a good point. But I really have hope when I look at my classmates. I also have a lot of hope when I see people who are older and have really, really changed over the pandemic, of their understanding of social justice, their understanding of racialized structures, and even seeing like older people who have really done the work and continue to possess this same vision for equity and the equal access for students who are minoritized. That honestly gives me a lot of hope, and that's why I'm still pursuing this career. But I'm not going to lie, I've already thought about dropping out because with every class you take, it's a really hard field.
Mm.
And I can see why people are very disillusioned, because you're going to be overworked and you're not going to get paid for it. Uh, or you'll barely get paid for it. But I think it's worth it, especially when I see on the micro level of seeing these students with mental health issues, or seeing these students start to grow into themselves too. I
Mm.
think that has really impacted me. Whenever I get disillusioned, I think back to my students,
Mm.
and that keeps me in this field too. So,
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's a great place for us to wrap up our conversation. Boyan, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for allowing us to open up your boundaries a little bit and to come in into your schedule. Really appreciate everything you shared, and I hope that for those of you listening, for both our audience coming from the Student Affairs Christian Network and the Emerging Scholars Network. I really hope this conversation is a blessing to you and just expands the ways that we think about praying for the next generation of higher education administrators. They are in a prime position to serve the campus in not just one-on-one with students, but also the structures that guide every step of the way for education. And so I hope this really helps us think intentionally how we can be praying and fasting for those who are working closest with students. So with that, thank you all for joining us for this episode, and we'll see you all next time.
thank you. See you.